Over to
Great.
you, Rick.
Thank you so much, Roland. And I do wish I could be there in person. I was a resident in Singapore for 10 over years, and I miss my chicken rice. I miss my laksa, and I was so looking forward to being with you here this evening. This will have to suffice. As Roland mentioned, we've been working on the topic of well-being. And what I'd like to do is to put that into the context of, well, the future of work. One of the hazards I found here at Johns Hopkins is Hopkins has somehow become synonymous with the coronavirus dashboard. And it's not unusual, unfortunately, for me to meet people and they say, oh yeah, you guys are the coronavirus guys. And that's not what we want. But my colleague, Beth Bauer, runs the dashboard, keeps track of where we are with the world. My job is a bit different. I look at human capital. What's going on in the world of human capital? How do we think about this? And right now, what is the effect of the pandemic on human capital? And it's in that vein that I'll share with you a bit of that and a focus on well-being. Well-being is a topic that I think around the world we've become better tuned to some of the things that are going on. So let's get started with an anchoring perhaps on the topic of human capital. Now I know what you're thinking, human capital, I know what that is. Those are all those people, and we're all one of them. And let me put this into a systems context first. We start with talent. And I don't mean by talent just the top talents. I mean all talents, all people that work in an organization. And obviously there we're focused on the right skills, the right capabilities. How do we attract, how do we retain, motivate, and manage our talent? But that's not all. Because guess what? We all know that we bring them in and we put them into structures, we put them into systems, all the processes, we give them job descriptions. Some people would argue that we find great talent and we box them into a corner called a job description with controls and reporting relationships and all the things that we do, well, to keep, organization around things. And then there's the culture, the organization culture, which is the ways of working, the common expectations that we have, kind of the unwritten rules of how things are done. And then there's leadership. Some would argue perhaps the evil leadership. In this case, we'll take a positive view of leadership and say, leadership provides the alignment and the direction, how we think about bringing all this together. And this creates what we call the human capital system, if you will. And this can be a great asset to the organization. And we know how this works, except this guy came along and seems to have disrupted our world in a lot of different ways. So let's take a look at each of the things that maybe this is impacting. We'll go through each of these four areas. And the first of which is structure. And one of the things that we all experienced as we suddenly needed to go to isolation, we needed to separate from each other is, well, where does work get done? How does work get done? When does it even get done? And so the work from home, mantra became pretty synonymous around the world. This is a quick graph of the rapid change going from really an average around 5% of employees being able to work from home to more than 60%. And in some parts of the world, that was even higher. Some occupations, some roles obviously still need to be done on site, regardless of what's going on. Now, as we look forward, that may change, but we see this rapid rise, a very swift shift, if you will, when it comes to structured and the COVID impact. Now, as we think about the longer term impact, what do we expect? What does the future hold? Will this remote working, this flexible schedule, hybrid, and what I mean by hybrid is, some days on site, some days off site. Well, looking across the employers and around the world, we see a number of things. One, for knowledge workers, we expect this to stay. This has been not just a one-time short, episode. This is a seismic shift, and in fact, some employers are only looking for remote workers. We'll talk a little bit about that great resignation. People are saying, well, wait a minute, I want a job that offers me more flexibility. Will we see this continue? The answer is yes. We're expecting this to continue. And even, in parts of Asia where this hasn't been as much of a trend as it has been in North America and Europe, we're also seeing more and more of this flexibility being baked into roles. So that may sound great for some folks. Others maybe, well, how do we figure that out? One thing I'd like to bring up is perhaps a bit of caution as we think about flexibility and equity. While there's great opportunity for this flexibility, studies have shown that, well, we can do this and we can do it well, but when we're working remotely, and we've got some employees working remotely, some employees working on site, how does that impact their careers? Through some pretty large scale studies, a number of researchers have looked at this over the years, and this is pre-pandemic, and found that those that are working remotely find a negative impact on their careers, their progression. So how do we think about that? And what's dangerous is if we look at the polls now and look at the gender differences, and here we see the response to, how often would you like to have work days at home? The 1 or 2 days, maybe more, men than women. People that were looking for a lot more flexibility, ability to work from home, tend to be more female. Well, that creates potentially a danger in terms of the inequity that we might see. And could this be an unintentional step backwards for gender equality? Something to watch as we go forward and figure out the new normal when it comes to structure. If we move to culture, there's been an impact on culture. The disruption, obviously, of our social cohesion, the way that we work with each other, those social interactions. It's not the formal meetings. We can do that on Zoom, just as we're doing now. But it's those casual interactions before and after the meetings. It's the walking the halls. It's running into people in the lifts. All those types of things have been a bit disruptive. And how does that work as we think about the culture of our organization? And so we see some of this, having an impact. And it's not an equal impact. One of the things that we note is that this really impacts those that are perhaps earlier in their career. If we look at this graph, those in their 20s and 30s, more likely to be feeling a bit lonely and isolated in their work. If we look at the need for learning, the learning that they're counting on in their occupation, probably more so than those of us at the other end of the graph here, are really impacted. And so how do we think about these types of things? And this is creating, depending on the industry, depending on the organization, a bit of an impact. What this gives rise to is the concern of employee well-being. And employee well-being has surfaced now as one of the major concerns around employment and employers around the world. Now, one of the things I just want to do is kind of set the record straight on what we mean by well-being. There's a lot of definitions out there, and I find that the term is being used, well, rather liberally, if you will. It's like, oh, how was your lunch today? Oh, it's not so great. My well-being, it just took a dive, I don't think that's what we mean. So there's a few components, and well-being comes from a medical orientation, and the World Health Organization has a very clear definition and very finite way of looking at well-being. From a psychology standpoint, we think about these 8 components of well-being around mental health. And so this revolves around a number of different things that become important. And there's a well-being continuum that I want to mention here as well. You may have heard, some people talking about, well, people are languishing in the world today, and that's used again a little bit liberally, but generally those are people that may be suffering a bit and not doing so well when we think about some of these measures. On the other end of the continuum are those that are flourishing, or thriving is sometimes used, and flourishing. And so we think about this, and this is a general population distribution. And if we think about, well, there's more than 50% of us that are just generally okay, and there's maybe 17% that are flourishing. And we'll come back to those measures later, but I just want to set the record straight of when we say well-being, what do we mean? And it's these types of things. Now, as we think about this employee well-being, we're trying to think about this more holistically, and employers are really starting to strive towards, how do I think about this? And what obligation do I have as a leader in the organization? And so in many cases, employers are becoming perhaps safety nets for employees. We see, that there's a lot more feeling of responsibility for employees, perhaps more so than pre-pandemic levels. But at the same time, employees are feeling the stress of the isolation. They're feeling the stress of what we're going through as a society, as organizations as well. Now, what we're seeing is, in the meantime, is that organizations are stepping up to this challenge. Organizations like Ernst & Young have launched total well-being orientation and training for their managers around the world to make sure that their leaders everywhere are equipped to help deal with this. Now, we really wanted to understand what is going on with well-being. And as Roland mentioned, we've launched a study to take a closer look at this. This year, we surveyed 14,000 people across 37 countries. We explored a number of key areas of well-being. And just like other research done in the past, we found that the percent of employees flourishing at this time wasn't so many. Are we all doing okay? Yes, we're doing okay. The numbers of us kind of flourishing in this process, not so high. And in fact, what I would suggest is that those areas more directly hit by the coronavirus, not doing quite as well as those that maybe have been spared. Also, and this pertains to Singapore, those that are in global hubs, those that are in densely populated areas, also more impacted from a well-being perspective, which is why I think this might be relevant as we move forward. Now, there's cultural impact, but there's also this leadership impact. And one of the things that the coronavirus has done is to perhaps add a bit of transparency around our manager capability. In other words, we've surfaced some manager weaknesses along the way. And so what I'll gently say here is we've got some management mavericks that are out there, which perhaps have decided, hey, this AI is great stuff. Now I can monitor my employees and all their activities. I can, understand exactly what they're doing all day. Isn't this great? Well, maybe that micromanagement isn't exactly what we need to be using some of the advanced tools for. And in fact, Gallup will tell us that engagement scores are down around the world, stress and fatigue are up, employees are feeling overworked and overburdened as a result. Now, a number of organizations have stepped up to this, which is great. And we're seeing much more of an inclusive approach or humanitarian leaders, kind of letting down their guard, connecting with people individually, creating flexibility, and really making individual health, individual needs a part of the equation. And where we see examples like that, around the world, I think that, we're seeing a lot more positive response, and particularly in light of, we'll talk about the Great Resignation as we see around the world. I was talking with some of my colleagues in Germany, and there was an employer there who stepped up to say, you know what we've done is really make this part of the leadership responsibility to be taking an inclusive approach. We used to have it just for diversity needs and diversity focus, but now we recognize that it's much broader than that. And we're using this inclusive approach for management across the board. And all of our managers have been through training. All of our leaders are taking an inclusive approach and holding each other accountable in a peer-to-peer relationship and checkpoint along the way. And I think those types of things can go quite a distance to make an impact. Now, if we turn to talent, what I'd call kind of demand and supply shift. And one of the things we know is that as we've shifted in this pandemic world, we've relied a lot more on technology, just as we are doing now. And so those technology skills are so in demand. Organizations have shifted to their processes being online. They've shifted for, data security, cybersecurity is super hot. All these types of tech skills are obviously, and as predicted, in demand. Maybe what wasn't as predicted is how fast we would need to move. I've admired Singapore's skills future orientation, which I think does great things in making the steps towards shifting some of the skills and helping to build all the right skills that people may need for the future. So perhaps a bit ahead of the game on that. In other areas, firms are actually losing market opportunities. They're losing revenue because of the lack of skills that they have on their teams. On the other side of things, we're seeing the Great Resignation around the world, this pent up employee shifting from organization to organization. At the same time, the growth of gig work or contract work is growing exponentially in some markets. And it's expected in some places, and here in the US, that it will be the majority of types of employment in the future. And it's kind of scary for those that are running an organization to think that 1 in 6 employees would prefer to be doing gig type work. One of the great highlights I learned at a conference I spoke at a couple of weeks ago was from a hotel. And they said, we had to, lay off a lot of our cleaning staff. We just didn't have people staying at the hotel. And so we just didn't have, the need for them. But now that travel is resuming, we wanted to bring them back. And we called the cleaning staff and they said, oh, sorry, we're busy. And we said, what? And they, sorry, but we'd be happy to work with you. But you see, we've created our own firm and we will now clean for you like we will with all the hotels, but we're going to do that on a contract basis. And we've got a per room rate that you might be interested in. It's like, wait a minute, you are my employees. Well, no, you let us go and we've created our own firm as a result. And we're seeing similar models with auto mechanics. We're seeing similar models in other services that, well, wait a minute, this is changing the game. And suddenly these types of models are beginning emerging with this orientation around things for gig work that we didn't really think about for gig work. So this new talent value proposition raises, a question, right? What are employees seeking? Well, can we stop them from going to this gig? Well, maybe not. Maybe we can, create something that's pretty powerful as we think about flexible work arrangements, perhaps, helping them to develop the skills they want for their future, thinking about those meaningful contributions. In other words, what's the purpose of what we're doing? How can we align that to what we're trying to accomplish in, as a firm that's also aligned to what people are interested in. And sometimes that has to do more with the impact on community, the impact in society, than it does the bottom line. And personal growth, how do we really create something special for our employees that really resonates? And so really thinking about this employee value proposition, how do we step back and really understand what's important for people today? I was working with a major bank in New York City who was really reevaluating this. There's like, we're losing people to the tech firms that offer this flexibility. What do we need to do? And they redeveloped an employee value proposition. And while the CEO was adamant, people need to be back on the office, we need to get everybody back, they called a timeout and said, wait a minute, let's reevaluate where people are, and then let's rethink what's the right way that we want to really focus on the important things. Is it really that important that everyone come to the office every day? Or should we create more meaningful connections when we come together? And is there actually a lot of work that can be a lot more productive when we're working from home? And so really rethinking that from a flexible work arrangement, but more so than that, which is to really re-anchor around the culture and the value of being a part of this organization versus something else that you could do on your own. And that's a different orientation for leaders today. So this talent is the other area that we want to make sure we address. And so each of the 4 areas of this human capital system have been affected by this COVID situation that we find ourselves in. And so as some in the human capital business would argue, is like, our human capital system has got COVID, and how do we get through this? I don't think it's quite that drastic, but I do think that through the pandemic, the way that we work, the future of work has been affected. If we're just thinking about one piece of this, I think we're missing the boat. And what I would encourage everyone to do is to think more holistically around the overall impact of our human capital model and the human capital system that we're operating in. Now, what does this mean? I think there's a few priorities for us as we think about the future. One is, employee well-being, taking a holistic approach to that, developing flexible or hybrid work models to think about what's the right function. How do we think about this for the type of role? The leadership, how do we address that? And rethinking the employee value proposition. But let me bring that into a Singapore context and suggest that there's really 2 things that we need to focus on in Singapore. And let me explain why that is. Inclusive leadership. Across Asia, we need to be mindful of what's going on in the Asian context. And I must say that, after 15 years of living across Asia and working in many of the countries, we do have, I must say, a number of micromanagement experts out there and some maverick management experts out there and across Asia. And if we look at the results of Singapore, this is Singapore versus global, around some of the questions that are indicative of inclusive or belonging, we're maybe not up to the same standards. And so in Singapore, I think we have to be extra vigilant around the management style. And I know at the top of the organization, we're generally pretty okay, but in all of the layers, how do we bring all of our managers up to the right standard in leadership? Now, the good news is that I think, we've got some examples right here in Singapore to draw from. Looking at the data from the best places to work in Singapore, there's many that are leading the charge with taking an inclusive approach, creating a sense of belonging, getting the psychological safety right, and migrating, to the right type of leadership style. And I think that is the good news and something we can learn from them. Now, the other point for Singapore is well-being. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Singapore, like many locations that are a global hub and densely populated, have been more severely impacted because the restrictions, by definition, need to be, well, stronger, and so that creates an impact. And so I think that raises the bar for Singapore. I'm sorry, but there's more work to be done. And so if we look at the well-being in Singapore relative to the global standard, we see we're not up to where the rest of the world is. And mind you, the rest of the world is not in a great place. They're doing okay, but where we are, we've got some room to grow. And so I think this is something that I think we're all focused on around the world. And in Singapore, I'm sorry to say that the bar is probably a bit higher, just given Singapore. So the good news is that if we look at the Singapore average relative to the best workplaces in Singapore, we've got some great examples to draw from. And this graph shows that, it's a significant gap, obviously, between the average Singapore employer and the great places to work in Singapore. And so how do we leverage those experiences along the way? And I've got 6 things here that I'll leave you with, which is, think about well-being, measure it. Think about, sending signals to the organization that this is important. Connecting with employees to experts, because sometimes we can't deal with this as managers and it's not appropriate, perhaps. Getting local champions, getting an environment together around ongoing learning and how we continue to change and improve, and empowering people to make a difference. So that's a quick run through of a lot of different things. Those are the things I'd leave you with an impact on Singapore, things to think about as we look forward. And hopefully what we're going to be doing is looking forward to a post-pandemic time. We won't talk about the new variant today. We'll talk about, let's get through this pandemic and how do we do this in a way that makes sense so that we can all become great places to work. It's been a pleasure to be with you. So thank you so much. And please feel free to connect with me just as we would if we could, post and pre-meetings. I look forward to hearing from you, and all the best with the rest of the event tonight.